My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He returns to the show. Hey, Jay, how you doing?
Hey, Tim.
Listen, well, thanks for coming on the show again. Of course, Jay is the host of Jay's Analysis and also Esoteric Hollywood, correct?
Correct, yes.
And you have a book coming out by that name in a few months, right?
Yes, by June, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film should be available, and that will be a lot of my top film reviews and others that people haven't seen.
And, well, tonight I wanted to discuss, well, you did a show a while back regarding MK Ultra and the Manchurian Candidate, John Mark's book, but also the broader issue, MK Ultra and mind control.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you about that today. Of course, MK Ultra was the CIA's research into human behavior or manipulating human behavior. It officially began in 1953, but I think it dates as early as back as 1950 under the moniker Bluebird.
Correct.
Then it became Artichoke, then MK Ultra, then MK Search, I think was the final official name. Basically, well, MK Ultra, mind control. What was that program? Let's hear your take on it.
Sure. Well, I want to preface too by saying that I do agree and have thought myself many times that once you do a good bit of research in these kinds of fields, you start to realize that a lot of these even so-called exposés are allowed exposés. So just because we're reading somebody's expose on the CIA or whatever does not necessarily mean that it's going to have all the dirt. It's only going to have the dirt that is allowed to be out. And one of the reasons that we know that is that I read some years ago John Mark's other book that he wrote with Victor Marchetti, which is the CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which is somewhat dated now. But you can tell that you're dealing with people who are obviously in this world. So the information that's coming out is going to be somewhat censored. I mean, that book itself includes a whole bunch of black lines and so forth. But that can actually kind of be a PR thing that helps sell books when you get black lines in your book, marking out things, because then it has the impression of juicy info that nobody knows. But nevertheless, I still think that we can gain quite a bit from these books, regardless, even if they're watered down and controlled. They do still tell a pretty good overall picture of what's going on. And so I read Marx's book last summer, and it is worth recapping and looking at. And I did do, yeah, you're right, I did that talk on that people can check out. But so for this, I think we have to go back to the military, and even prior to the military, we have to look at Huxley and his circle and the Tavistock Institute and so forth. So it's kind of Huxley, I think you could argue, that was sort of nascent in getting the generic plan of what would be MK Ultra going. So Huxley was promoting the ergots and these different hallucinogens, prior to Time Magazine and prior to MK Ultra and prior to the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and so forth, and Gordon Wasson and these characters. And Huxley thought that this could really bring about a revolution, at least so he said. But the revolution that he's talking about, that he describes in his famous introduction to Brave New World, is not a revolution that is going to really free people. This is a revolution, the final revolution of the technocrats. And that is an excellent element that Marx does bring out in his book. So he will talk about the fact that when you get into the 40s, according to Marx, it's into the 40s that the military started thinking what we need to do is figure out a way to make people more docile, malleable, and controllable, even to the point in chapter 3 we have discussions of getting rid of free will. So the military was interested in saying, well, could we create a soldier who actually had no free will? That's important because that's exactly what Bertrand Russell said in his works. He said, in the future, what we're going to need is a society of people that don't have the functioning of free will. In fact, it needs to be stamped out. And with other British intelligence types like George Orwell, Eric Blair, this is exactly what we see O'Brien telling Winston in 1984. He says, I'm here to stamp out your human spirit, to get rid of your free will. I'm going to put my boot on your face forever. So when we look at Impact of Science on Society and these works of Bertrand Russell, that's kind of the premier technocrat that we could find, and that's going to tie into what we're going to talk about later on in the interview with scientism and technocracy. But I want to point out that that's the beginning of the mindset behind the people who would be doing MK Ultra. So that was a great point that not a lot of people talk about, that Marx brings out, and that's relevant because it's not, as you said, about creating these mind control couriers and so forth so much as it is how can this be applied on a mass scale. And it's precisely with these early military tests that they started to realize that, all right, we need a drug that could, initially they wanted a truth serum, right? So they were looking for something that could work to you get the enemy to divulge secrets or whatever. So they tried things like pot and different narcotics, and those didn't work out too well because I guess everybody just got the munchies and was eating Fritos and Fritos. They weren't really telling the government secrets. So the idea was hatched. I should add too that a lot of the early on guys in this were connected to the OSS, and so the OSS, of course, features people like Roald Dahl, who would write Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right? So it was Roald Dahl with Ian Fleming and William Stevenson, who would be instrumental in helping the Americans set up their so-called national security apparatus, where in 1942 the OSS is created, and then in 1947 you have the National Security Council and the CIA being created out of the OSS. And so it's Bill Donovan, working with all these British PSYOP masters to create this agency that would be involved in these kinds of covert operations, all under the guise, of course, of keeping America free and keeping America safe and extending American foreign policy into countries that were supposedly hostile to the U.S. and our so-called freedoms. That, however, is not ultimately what this agency would be doing and being involved in. It would ultimately be involved in drug trafficking and mind control and black operations, covert operations, regime changes, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody probably has a basic idea of that kind of stuff that the CIA does. But what they started realizing was that these different drugs, going back in the 40s or late 40s and 50s, that they were testing troops on, that you could get all kinds of different effects with these different drugs. And it's a particular character by the name of Gordon Wasson who would begin to figure prominently in this, who also worked with J.P. Morgan and yet had these government ties as well, where he was hatched this plan of, actually, because he was into there's a term for the study of mushrooms that escapes me at the moment, but he was really into mushrooms. So, and he and his wife would take these trips down to Mexico and different countries in Latin America, South America, wherever, and they started realizing that, actually, the techniques of the shamans, and this is what other writers who've written on MK Ultra point out, is that they kind of looked at indigenous religions, and they would kind of do these ethnographies of the indigenous religions, and they say, the shaman seems to have a lot of power through what he can do, and this is where you get people like Carlos Castaneda, working with different universities to kind of do the same thing that was going on, and with the ideas of the Wassons and the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and so forth. And Jay Stevens' book touches on this as well, Storming Heaven, the story of LSD. And so the CIA, then what they would do is kind of contract, and now the CIA, of course, is early on is quite a few Air Force people, right? So this is where the military element comes into it. So they would contract with different pharmaceutical outfits to produce this new lysosyl diethylamide that was derived from the ergot and these different psilocybin, these mushrooms and so forth. And so they started running these tests on different soldiers, and as you pointed out, this is where we get the transition from Bluebird to Artichoke. And this is going on at places like Fort Detrick and other bases, and they're kind of running these backroom tests on soldiers. And then the idea is hatched to I should point out, by the way, that Josiah Macy of the Macy Foundation was also involved in putting money into this operation. So here you have a direct connect between Sandoz, Macy's, J.P. Gordon Wasson working with J.P. Morgan. Here's the corporate, so-called private sector, hand in hand with the so-called public government sector.
It's a public-private partnership.
Exactly. So what happened was they started running these tests on these unfortunate soldiers, and then they got the idea, well, why don't we branch out into places like universities? And this is what most people don't know, is that MK Ultra is not this secret underground base experiment type thing. It's going on at your local university. It was a lot of university professors, psychologists, and so forth that are really taking part in this, more so than some hooded James Bond type figure, cloak and dagger types. It's more so a university and psychiatric world that is the locus of MK Ultra. I think it was some 40 plus universities were involved in this program, and Marx mentions places like, what is it? He says Boston Psychopathic, Mount Sinai Hospital at Columbia University, Carl Pfeiffer, University of Illinois Medical School, Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Louis Jolyon West, one of the prominent doctors, was at the University of Oklahoma, University of Rochester, and so forth and so on. And we have this list of just countless so-called government facilities and mental institutes that are the locus of what would be MK Ultra. And what they started realizing was that massive doses of this lysosomal diethylamide would create schizophrenia, and you would get disassociation, you would get people in altered states, mind splitting, and so forth. There's that 70s film that's kind of interesting that touches on this, where they're actually doing the experiments, I think, at a university. Is it not Jeff Daniels? Who the movie Altered States?
Oh, Altered States, yeah. I know who you talk. I know the actors you talk.
Yeah, that's going on at the university, right?
John Hurt.
Yeah. There's sensory deprivation tanks, right? So this was going on as well, where they would give soldiers a lot of LSD and then say, hey, stick him in the tank and see what he does, right?
Did they ever turn to a caveman? No.
Right. Biodome. Pretty much, I would say a kind of psychopathic attitude is the main point here on the part of these doctors and psychologists, psychiatrists that are the professor arm of this are extremely psychopathic, and they have no scruples whatsoever about experimenting on human beings. And the main dark figure in this regard would be Dr. Ewan Cameron, who comes out in Marx's book as the most notorious, where they were experimenting on blacks, they were experimenting on soldiers, they were experimenting on people in mental institutes, of people with drug addiction, and so it's under the guise of mental health, which is important because that, of course, plays a big role in, say, Obamacare, right? It's under the guise of mental health that a lot of this is going on, a lot of these psychiatric institutes. So scopolamine would play into this, which is, of course, the notorious drug that wipes out one's will, although that didn't work out well for the original intention of creating the couriers and so forth. But it's important that MK Ultra doesn't just connect with Tavistock and the LSD. It's part of the biowarfare department, right? So originally it was under biowarfare and wet works and that kind of stuff. And they even talked about and discussed aerosol spraying of these things. Now, we've all probably heard about the different declassified programs of the military spraying different cities as part of their biowarfare testing programs. But it's from this milieu from which MK Ultra arises as well. So special operations divisions, right, early people in the OSS, these are the people who are masterminding this. The ideas, I believe, they got from the British Royal Society and those nefarious cats like Huxley and Russell. So other elements do come in that you pointed out that we probably shouldn't touch on too much, just because that's everybody knows about the couriers and the altars and things like that. But these, according to at least these books, these are elements that were part of the studies. They did realize that in Project Bluebird and Artichoke that you could produce these schizophrenic states where people would have multiple personalities. And I've been around druggies, I've been around people in the drug scene before. I've done, in my younger, stupider days, some hallucinogens, and I can completely see how this would be possible, and you could have people emerging with split psyches, and in fact, Marx does even cite Huxley at one point in his book, talking about the splitting of the person's psyche, and this is page 113, where he cites Gordon Wasson, and then at some point in here, maybe we're just talking about Albert Hoffman, these different doctors who were involved in this. At some point, there's a quote from Huxley that touches on split personalities. I think it's page 119. And this is where we get figures like Tim Leary, who would be part of the hippie revolution to promote this to the masses. And they do this through their also, I believe, created counterculture, which Dave McGowan touches on in his Laurel Canyon book. And so I think that it's pretty solid in my view that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, electric Kool-Aid acid test. These are actually from the establishment to steer the counterculture in a certain way, ultimately to engineer society as a whole. So it really wasn't about anti-war or any of that. It was all about the mass control and brainwashing, on a mass scale.
Yeah, because we all have heard about the lurid stories, the Hollywood stories, the sexy stories about mind-controlled assassins, patsies, couriers, sex slaves, and these things. Well, obviously those did exist, but they're the ones that get to play. But behind all that is a much more ambitious and arguably more sinister agenda to manipulate and control society through whether mass drugging or just general mind control. Also mass trauma, because I think wasn't it Tavistock who observed from World War I shell shock?
Yes.
That you could break the psyche, and instead of trying to cure that, they weaponized it.
Well, here's a good quote from Wasson. He says, describing one of the trips, he says, they emerged from the center of our field of his trip. They emerged, these forms, from the center of the field of our vision, opening up as they came. Vivid in color, they were always harmonious. He talks about seeing art motifs, you might see textile patterns and so forth. But then he goes on to say that, could the miraculous mobility that I was now enjoying in the explanation for the flying witches that I saw play some important part in the folklore and fairy tales of Northern Europe? In other words, he's kind of hinting that, well, maybe folklore and folk tales come from people doing some sort of hallucination. Mm-hmm. These reflections passed through my mind at the very time that I was seeing the vision, for the effect of the mushrooms is to bring about a fission of the spirit and a split in the person's psyche, a kind of schizophrenia, with the rational side continuing to reason and to observe the sensations that the other side of the mind is enjoying. And I think that that's definitely the case. This is Project 58, which most people know as MK Ultra, because there were dozens of different projects based on different drugs.
And that was the famous Life magazine cover, correct?
Exactly, right. That's Gordon Wasson there. And then you have other quotes by, Wasson says it again, the very same thing about seeing other worlds and having his mind split and so forth. And then Marx goes on here to discuss Huxley's book Doors of Perception, which would deal with the same topic. And of course, Doors of Perception is where the Doors get their name. If you remember, there's actually some interesting scenes in Oliver Stone's presentation of the Doors, where Val Kilmer is playing Jim Morrison, and if you think about that scene where they're out in the desert and they're like bouncing around, tripping, and Jim Morrison's like, I broke on through to the other side, man.
Yeah, it's. I remember when I saw that, I was like, "What's going on here?"
Well, that is the effect that LSD gives. It gives some people in the drug counterculture will call it solving the world, where you get this sense that, I'm spiritual now, I've transcended things, I've figured things out, I've solved the world, right? So then you come back from that and you kind of get I'm like the enlightened guru now. Mm-hmm. That is the effect that it gives, and I think that is the history of kind of indigenous religions and shamans, using these things, giving them that sense of thinking that they're quasi-divine or divine or whatever. And this is what we see in a lot of the cults. A lot of cult leaders, who do drugs, come back with this impression that they're divine, and that's what happens. A lot of people take these drugs and they come back and I'm God. Yeah, I think. Right, and so what when you get up into the Ewan Cameron section of the book, and this is the Mount Royal in Montreal, the facility where Ewan Cameron did his work, he took it to the next level of the patterning and the programming, and he said, oh, okay, actually the mind kind of works in this way where it's patterned according to Pavlovian operant conditioning and input response type stuff that we've all learned from childhood and so forth. And Cameron thought that what you could do is actually de-pattern a person and create a vegetable, he says. And the idea here was that you could return to the tabula rasa, blank slate of like John Locke and these different empiricist philosophers, that you could wipe the slate clean and start over, right? And I could see how he would think that, given what you witnessed in different people who've gone through these kind of drug trips and whatnot. There's an interesting series of videos the BBC did. I can't remember, the guy's name was Bruce Bruce something, I forget, but it was this show where they sent this guy, a complete idiot, to go and take the initiatory drugs of like a whole bunch of different tribes. This guy was a complete moron. This guy went through the initiation of like 15 different tribes of just like the worst imaginable drugs. I probably drove the guy insane, but assuming that this is real, the BBC didn't stage it all.
Yeah.
You can watch this guy go through these different rituals and through these different hallucinogens, and you'll see what I'm getting at, right? Because so when he goes through certain ones, he's like, oh, I feel one with everything, right? And so this is also, by the way, where sort of the New Age philosophy will emerge out of the hippie drug culture post 60s and 70s. But it's Cameron who really did the hardcore work on the idea of deprogramming, depatterning people's minds, and then what you would do is come along and repattern it and reprogram it with certain images and symbols and so forth. And I think this is probably where a lot of people get the whole Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland is all part of this, because the only thing that I could find directly connecting MK Ultra to like Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland is according to Marx, one of the students one of the test patients that Cameron was working on was this woman. I think she's unnamed, or they call her Lauren or something. But yeah, Lauren. Lauren went through the process that Cameron described as first step was that you go through memory loss, and it's also combined with electroshock, right? So electroshock was kind of in vogue in the 40s and 50s, and even prior to that. And you basically shock everybody you shock these people for 15 to 30 to 60 days while you're giving them LSD, you're torturing them. And first they have memory loss, then they have the loss of space-time relations, and then he says they lose all the anxiety and they become a vegetable. And then he says what you do is you come along with psychic driving, and this is that programming where the mind he thinks is blank, and then you play cassette tapes. This is curious because this is actually what we see in Brave New World, where they have what they call the hypnopedic chants, where everybody who goes to sleep at night after they take their soma listens to these hypnopedic mind programming cassette tapes. This also comes up, by the way, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the Ian Fleming story with Bond, where Blofeld hatches this plot to brainwash these hot chicks under the guise of an allergy clinic through hypnopedic tapes at night. So that actually is, according to Marx at least, a Ewan Cameron hatched scheme.
And reportedly down at Guantanamo Bay, too, they do that.
Say what?
At Guantanamo Bay.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about Gitmo and Guantanamo Bay reportedly doing a lot of the same stuff. Exactly. That's a great point.
So, and that's the one where he has sort of modified something like a football helmet or something. And
right.
Yeah.
Now, to tie this into more big money, one of the universities where this was going on was McGill University, and this was paid for by Canadian Defense Force money and Rockefeller money. So this was one of the ones where they used the sensory deprivation tank on one of the test patients, and if you watch that first episode of The Twilight Zone, that's exactly what's going on. It's the military guy who's put under all these mind control tests, and they put him in a sensory deprivation tank, and he thinks he's gone back to his hometown, and you find out the whole time he's been in a sensory deprivation.
Oh, that's right. That's when the whole town's empty or something.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
okay.
out of this sensory deprivation tank. But Cameron, what we get, the impression we get, is that he's just this complete monster. He views himself as God. According to Marx, he would even secretly dose his fellow MK Ultra doctor buddies. And that's just insane. I mean, you got to be charged for murder for this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people, can die from this stuff. There's the reported case of Frank Olson, right, who was working with all these guys, and he supposedly leapt from the building. His family never got an answer as to what exactly happened, and if I recall, it was settled out of court by the government.
Yeah, his case was he apparently had some trouble with some of the things he saw go down.
Right.
One, I think, was a massacre of North Korean prisoners of war.
Right.
That were being tested on, then they were ordered to dig their own grave, and they were shot dead. And he started, I guess maybe making waves or expressing misgivings about this. And he was dosed at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of dosing each other seems to be like a trend among these guys.
Exactly, yeah. And, if you've ever had a bad trip, that could be the worst thing ever. I mean, you can lose your mind. It's Russian roulette with your mind.
And I did a show with James Corbett talking about the Manchurian Candidate, the movie.
Right.
On his show, Film Literature, New World Order.
Yes.
And one thing a point I made was one thing that's interesting in that movie is you see things that the communists are doing, like shooting people, having them shoot each other. That's what the CIA was doing with MK Ultra.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, that's the exact point that I was making in the analysis of Notorious by Hitchcock and North by Northwest, is that we're under the impression that it's only the Soviets and the Russians that use sex spies. Yet in both of those films, Cary Grant in Notorious plays the Romeo sex spy who seduces Ingrid Bergman and turns her into a sex worker. And it's Eva St. Marie, who's a sex operative in North by Northwest. Mm-hmm. So curiously, those films are actually portraying what the CIA too would do, right? It's not like the Soviets were the only ones.
Yeah, and I guess the Thorndike character, he's more sympathetic because he's supposedly decent. He's kind of roped into this thing, against his will, and he makes that. I think I put a comment on your website about that, how he says finds out that I guess her name's Eve in the movie, Eve Kendall,
right?
Has to sleep with this Soviet spy, for God, King, and Country, I guess. Yep. And what's the actual exchange? He goes, says, well, I guess
around town. He says something like that. Right?
Yeah, war is hell, even a cold one. Said,
yeah, that's it. He
said,
right.
well, in this war, if women like her have to sleep with men like that, maybe we should stop trying to win these cold wars. The idea is you're losing yourself, you're losing your decency in winning this war. You're becoming your enemy, which is again, I think, a opportunistic or meme right there, because let's face it was RSI didn't need any help in that endeavor. They were perfectly willing to do these things before, but it's a great exchange in there. But I think you made a comment about that, how he was how the CIA was able to set up the press and put a picture in the newspaper in that movie.
Yeah, and then they stage his death, right?
Yeah. But yeah, that's one of those. That's one of my favorite Hitchcock movies.
Yeah, me too. I was like North by Northwest, that and Burger.
The best scene I like now is when he's in the study, doesn't know what's going on, and they think he's somebody else. The dialogue in that is so good.
Yeah, but of course, then there's always that weird relation to his mom, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, because he's a bachelor. That's right. Older bachelor.
And now I recall you mentioning the rumor of Cary Grant and
yes.
What was the source for that? I couldn't remember where you heard that.
Neil Sanders.
Okay.
He was talking there. It's a rumor. I mean, a lot of these things you don't know. I just made it. My point was a lot of the problems with accepting these things is they fall in love with the image, the Cary Grant character, as opposed to the man. And so when they find something like that, like Cary Grant could be a deviant, a sexual deviant, they're not going to believe it because they know Cary Grant from North by Northwest.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you made that point about Bob Hope, and
Yeah.
We saw the same thing with Sinatra, to bring this back to, as I understand, Sinatra was doing some spying too because of all of his mob connections.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's Sinatra who is, a primary player in The Manchurian Candidate.
Mm-hmm.
It's also interesting too that in both these Hitchcock films that we mentioned and in The Manchurian Candidate, this is prior to most anyone knowing that there was such a thing as MK Ultra. I've always found that fascinating. So that's a great, almost golden example of predictive programming, or revelation of the method, whatever you want to call it, because nobody's heard of this program. And I think the Richard Condon novel was 1959, and the movie is 62 or 3 or something. Mm-hmm. And so nobody knew about this stuff, and yet it's already being put into these books. Now, some people might think that that was kind of on purpose. I don't know, but regardless, these are realities that are figuring into fiction, and that brings me to one of the most curious aspects of Marx's book, which ties into Hollywood, and that is Flipper, believe it or not. Because there's this kind of B movie, Day of the Dolphins, which is based on one of the MK Ultra doctors, Mr. Lilly.
I remember it well, George C. Scott. Yeah.
Right, and so Lilly had this idea of maybe we could use dolphins, and this is part of MK Ultra, and what they wanted to do was to I got to read it because it's too good not to read. A scientist who worked in the CIA Navy program states that some of the dolphins were sent to Vietnam during the 60s and got out of their pens and disappeared, unheard of for being trained dolphin. John Lilly confirms that a group of the marine mammals stationed at Cameron Bay did go AWOL.
So long, and thanks for all the fish. No,
and they returned covered with attack marks made by other dolphins. So apparently the other dolphins attacked the CIA assassin dolphins. But they were like putting like pokers on their snouts or whatever. It was a really bizarre idea. They were trying all kinds of different stuff to see if they could train these.
Yeah, that reminds me of the experiment with the cat, with the surveillance cat.
Right.
Spend $1 million in that first day test. It runs out in the street, gets hit by a car.
Well, he then goes on to talk about the defection of Yuri Nosenko from the KGB, and they think that the CIA, according to Marx at least, thought this might have some connection to Oswald, and so Nosenko was put into a whole bunch of a 12 by 12 vault, and it was not allowed to read anything or have any light, or they did all this kind of brutality upon him, supposedly during his defection to see what would happen there. But
and that was just done this, not so much to get intelligence, just to see what the reaction would be.
Right, and that's what goes on to. There's an excellent chapter after that called Human Ecology, where he discusses sort of the ethics of the electrode implants, which according to Jolyon West and Sidley Gottlieb, this would be kind of where they would get into, and I think maybe Jose Delgado as well, who writes open books on mind control. I think he has a book, Hypnosis and Mind Control, by Jose Delgado.
Implants, things like that, yeah.
This is where they get into the electronic implants, and this is because MK Ultra would also have a rough connection to the Manhattan Project, because the Manhattan Project is what would be the overarching chemical and biowarfare research that was going on at these different places like Fort Detrick and so forth. And so MK Ultra is kind of under that umbrella as well. And what you start to notice, especially when you read McGowan's books, and if you look at the research of some other people online, you'll notice that the Atomic Energy Commission, right, the Manhattan Project and all that didn't get shut down. It turned into the Department of Energy. And that's why at Oak Ridge facility, where the Manhattan Project was going on, here pretty close to me in Tennessee, that's now the NSA supercomputer facility under the Department of Energy. So, in other words, I'm just saying that the argument that I've been making all along is that it's not like it's this one instance of, oh, we've got this MK Ultra program over here. It's rather that it's all under the aegis of a complete full spectrum dominance approach to not just man, but man and his environment. And that's why I think Mark Hacker used the term first, full spectrum subversion, which I thought was a good term, because under the guise of Cold War, which is when all this is going on, right? From this is post World War II on into throughout the Cold War, it's all, we've got to do all this because of the Soviets. We've got to do all this because of the Soviets, and then meanwhile you've got Anthony Sutton's work about the Western industrialists building up the Soviet Empire.
Yeah, funding the Soviet Union from the get-go.
Right.
And it's funny you meant human ecology or ecology exists. The Human Ecology Fund was the CIA front that funded Ewan Cameron's work, at least part of the work he did. Yeah. So
we should point out too that this also will tie into DNA research, according to Marx in that same chapter, pages 162 and 63. He'll talk about they wanting to sort of sequence the genome, and this of course ties back to the Royal Society and Watson and Crick, and the reason I bring that up is because that shows that this is not just mind control; it's mind-body control and environment control is the whole thing. That's what they're concerned with. It's controlling the entire biosphere. And the electronic stuff that is mentioned, the implants and the electrodes and all that, hypnoshock, the shock therapy and all that Cameron would do, that's going to tie into where we get the notion of electromagnetic warfare, which is very real. Brzezinski mentioned it in Between Two Ages back in 72 or 73. And we have that famous Michael Aquino PSYOP Psy-War document, Mind War Psy-War, where at the end, in the footnotes, he says explicitly that a huge part of what will be waged upon populace, right, not enemy combatants, enemy nations, but upon the populace, is electromagnetic warfare. Well, that is part of MK Ultra.
And you wonder why everyone has smartphones now, right?
Yes, and that gets to Dr. Schwitzkabel's machine, which if you do some research on Schwitzkabel, you'll find out that was not just a prison experiment, that Ewan Cameron got the idea of using this machine that prisoners would carry around on their ankles or whatever, that would relay information about their heart rate, their locale, and so forth, based on the idea of the panopticon prison system. But also, that is exactly what the Apple iWatch does. Right? So, in other words, that's an example of how public-private corporate government takes things from these private military government studies in culture and so forth, and then puts it out there to the masses. And we have the impression that, Sony is competing with Apple. And then they release it's like the exact same phone, right? I mean, like the operating system of Apple might be a little bit different from like a Sony, but and there might be there's a level of competition, but the hardware and the software is all coming out of the same military-industrial complex, and it's the same military-industrial complex who's doing Manhattan Project, who's involved in biowarfare research, who's doing the LSD social engineering.
You want to get into mind control and just mind screwing. I've read. Are you familiar with Miles Mathis?
I am.
Did you read his article on Stephen Jobs?
No, I've read about 4 or 5 of them, and some of his stuff I think is a little just.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily.
But there's also insights there, yeah.
It's food for thought. A lot of all of what we do is food for thought. I'm sorry, not like I can get a FOIA request or subpoena the documents and prove this stuff. That's not
even get the FOIA request. I mean.
But
operating on the principle that the government's going to be honest. Right?
Yeah, but I know he also won a Fidel Castro that you might find interesting. But lifetime actor.
I pointed out that Castro's an actor.
Yeah, and he
has an IMDb page where he started. I pointed that out many times. He was an extra in some films in the 40s.
And he just makes some ludicrous points regarding Bay of Pigs and how ridiculous how this why would they invade there when they had a huge base there they could operate from? But it is that's a whole other topic. It is funny you mention this stuff. But when you mentioned something like the Manhattan Project, and of course it's retailed to the public as so this crash program to develop an atomic bomb to beat out the Nazis, so you can win World War II. Of course, it's much more than that. And there was a program, and you mentioned the Atomic Energy Commission or the Department of Energy now. that became the Manhattan Project. But it's now known that under the Atomic Energy Commission did experiment on not only soldiers,
Yeah, with British.
but the general population.
Yes.
I think there was a thing, it was called Operation Green Run. They actually released radioactive iodine 131 was released over from the Hanford nuclear facility on purpose and sent over Spokane, Washington. And this is just to see what the effects would be.
Well, and this is because, and I think this is probably accurate. I mean, Marx argues in the close of the book that MK search is what would take over for MK Ultra. So when there's investigations into it, right, and the government says, "Oh yeah, okay, you caught us. We'll stop now." They just move it to a different place and rename it. And this is where it comes under the rubric of chemical and biological warfare, and that's the argument that Marx makes. And he says that the chemical services that were offered were. Well, he talks about the Freedom of Information Act that was had and so forth, and that all that happened was just moving it to a different locale, and so it becomes a focus on this is what, according to him, is where the focus starts to shift over to RF and EMF research, and that's exactly what we see, in Aquino's Mind War Side War document.
And of course, when the I guess it was the
they would cut off monkey heads and they would try to beam frequencies out of the monkey heads. This is what they were doing with your tax money, by the way. This is like, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars of tax money, and they're chopping off monkey heads like faces of death.
Yeah. The documents MK Ultra were all, most of them were destroyed, I think, in 1973 under the order of Richard Helms, I think Sidney Gottlieb, who destroyed the documents, then resigned, and I think went off to work in a monastery somewhere in the east, like in Asia somewhere, I think. Of course, what remained were those financial documents which John Marx used to write his book, and curiously, they survived. Now, that could just be good luck, or it could be because, as you alluded to earlier, that some of these books are limited hangouts, And even the people that are writing limited hangouts might be well-intentioned.
Could be, yeah.
Because they can only do so much. I mean, if you figure I can only do this much. What else can I do? So it's not these people may not be sinister figures, but they are controlled.
Well, and it's important to point out too that it's from this same milieu of MK Ultra and these various programs and testing that we get Stanford Research Institute, and this is where we get the movements into the idea of what's in John Ronson's book.
Many Hysteric Goats.
Yeah, Many Hysteric Goats, and the whole idea of a First Earth Battalion, of creating these hippie special forces.
Yes. They were like, they could try to walk through walls.
Right, and so, but it's weird because it moves into trying to jump into the realm of the occult, where they want to try to do ESP research and remote viewing, and that you can look up the actual white papers from Stanford on remote viewing. So that was all. How real that was, I don't know, but that was all at least a real attempts and real programs. And reportedly, I think Hacker translated a piece for Espionage History Archive that was talking about the Kremlin psychic spies. So, both sides of this dialectic are doing all the same stuff, right?
Yeah. And so is it ESP or intuition? I don't know. I heard someone tell me one time that the Asians tend to have better intuition than the Westerners, tend to be more rational. So that's interesting. Well, that's no fair because they're 14 hours ahead of us, so they obviously know things in advance, right?
Curious too that in this same chapter at the end, he talks about the idea of genetic modification and manipulation. This is the last few pages, and he says that this is kind of the outworking of where all of this logic goes. And he even talks about the attempt to create the super soldiers. Right now, I'm not sure that I think that there's literally necessarily a super soldier, but I think that you can see the idea here with we do have mainstream pieces from Wired and so forth where DARPA talks about their plan to create a super soldier.
Yeah.
And Marx does connect a lot of this to DARPA, and I think that's important because you start to see that DARPA is actually not disconnected from MK Ultra. It's the same mindset of the technocrat of scientism that man can be perfected, man can be recreated, changing images of man, that famous white paper.
Yeah.
That whole idea, and it stems back to MK Ultra, so that's why it's important.
That's right. You go almost. It's almost a form of alchemy, I guess you could
Oh,
suggest.
absolutely, I think so.
But we're not necessarily talking about like Dolph Lundgren here. We're talking.
Well, somebody made a point. I forget what I was reading the other day, but they were saying, yeah, actually, Universal Soldier, that dumb movie with Van Damme and Dolph,
Yeah.
it's about super soldiers. I'd forgotten that, but that's actually what it's about.
Because there was a I saw a documentary on the First Earth Battalion,
Uh-huh.
and I think it was I think it was based on Ronson's book. It's a documentary. I know there's a movie made. There's also a documentary I could watch on YouTube. And there's one case where one of these soldiers thought that they could, I guess, meditate, and they could lie down and have a jeep drive over them, a vehicle, and he'd be okay. And apparently the guy drove over too fast, and he wasn't able to concentrate, and he killed the guy. So that's actually in the documentary. I was like, and they have that weird guy in Hawaii living in the mountains somewhere who's
Yeah.
I remember that some sort of a swami up there, but he's like a
It's
current.
that we can borrow ideas from the yogis and
Yeah.
tap into Buddhist monk techniques or whatever.
Which I think it could be just a form of mysticism and more confusion, and also people just a lot of free time on other people's money to spend, right?
Well, you got to put that earmark money somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's that's part of the phenomenon. You got so much money to spend, why not? So,
$800 hammers and $10,000 monkey head experiments, right?
mm-hmm. Or you can always say, we spent $10 million here, only spent $1 million, and steal the $9 million.
Take the rest of it.
Yeah, that's an old trick, So, but in your talk, of course, what we talk clear is under the umbrella of MK Ultra, they're doing a lot of these real brutal experiments on human beings, often unwittingly. But the sad thing is, one of the targets were children, because children were easier to, I guess, to create MPD or DID, dissociative identity disorder.
That is the storyline.
Yeah, and George Estabrooks, I think, wrote a memo to J. Edgar Hoover specifically about that very thing.
Right.
To deal with juvenile delinquents, I guess, supposedly.
Well, and curiously, to tie it back into Hollywood, it had been forever since I watched Willy Wonka. That was, as we said, Roald Dahl, right? And so, of course, been aware of Tavistock and the connections to Hollywood and all that, and the idea of social engineering through media. And Dahl was, of course, buddies with Walt Disney. And in Willy Wonka, what you have is this strange sort of, I've read, the idea was he was kind of supposed to be a Howard Hughes type character, but not exactly, just kind of a loosely that kind of person. What does he do? He recruits a bunch of kids and runs these crazy psyops on them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And of course, the story.
No qualms about killing them either.
That's right. It was just, you're watching, you're just laughing at it as you watch it, because it's in the context of a sort of a kid's story or a fairy tale. Yeah, and same with like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fleming's kid story, exactly.
And you always should make the same case regarding Wizard of Oz. Of course, that predate, and that's the story itself. I think, but it was the way it's adapted. But there's all types of imagery in that too, as well.
And that's directly out of Theosophy, right?
Yeah. And was it Frank Baum? I think wrote that.
Right.
Yeah. But as far as we have these experiments going on. Of course, it's all top secret, and it gets exposed in the 70s. And you have the hearings, and I mentioned before that all the records are destroyed except for the financial records. So we're never quite sure if it ever goes operational. We just have to infer from the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But you earlier you mentioned cults and their function and the ties of these cults to intelligence agencies.
Absolutely.
And one cult that brings to mind is, of course, the Jonestown.
Sure.
And the Jonestown massacre, which all the evidence suggested it at least had intelligence ties. Jones himself was he was an itinerant preacher, broke, and all of a sudden in the early 60s he turns up with a lot of money and resources. He's able to travel, and
And while he was in Brazil?
Yeah, in Brazil, yeah.
He had these connections with Dan Mitrione, who
Yeah.
the dark intelligence connections, and it's there that he was interested in candomblé, which is the sort of indigenous religious manifestation that's, I guess, quasi Santeria voodoo type stuff.
Hmm.
The idea being that what techniques, what religious techniques for manipulation could be derived from candomblé, and that's, I think, partly why his appeal was to blacks.
Hmm. Now he it's funny. There's a Vatican document, or at least Catholic Church document, complaining about CIA funding of ministries in Brazil.
Right.
Like, hey, this is unfair. And of course, you get into things like World Vision, which is an evangelical missionary group which has ties to intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And Jones had ties to that, which World Vision has ties to Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley, the would-be assassin of Ronald Reagan, and of course Mark David Chapman, the one who was blamed for killing John Lennon in 1980.
Yeah, and isn't a evangelical missionary a great legend or cover?
Yeah, it's a great. Of course, missionaries have always historically been used for that, particularly in China with the Rockefellers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a standard cover. But with what's interesting, Jonestown, of course, he was able to attach himself to the political elite, particularly in San Francisco. He was named head of the Housing Commission by Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of his friends were given jobs in the welfare agencies to give him access to a lot of these poor people that he eventually recruited or brought down to Jonestown while keeping their welfare payments, which is illegal. They left the country. But no one did anything about it. He was getting like $2 million a month in collective payments or something from social services.
Yeah, how did he
Yeah.
gadfly about so easily?
And he also turned out to vote for Moscone. So you see there's a give and take here.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the Jonestown massacre occur, which some people think was was some sort of mass mind control operation, and it was just a cleanup operation. And then a week later, Moscone is assassinated by this guy Dan White, who's a former police operative, and then he's a councilman or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then he commits suicide like 7 years later. But that connection, where you suggest that maybe that was kind of loose ends, or so they're cleaning things up.
Well, it's important that we keep in mind that a lot of these operations have multiple uses.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my view, like a lot of these big mega churches, they're not just spying on people, with like FEMA connections or whatever. They're also money laundering operations. I mean, we've seen this many times with these, big fake TV preachers. Jim Bakker, they were laundering money. Jimmy Swaggart, did he just have a sex scandal, or was he involved? Anyway, I've seen articles at least alleging that Paul and Jan Crouch of TVN, that Paul Crouch had some kind of mafia connection, was laundering money, and the FBI was investigating him. Mm-hmm. We've seen this many times. I'm just making the point that it's not just like a mind control spy type thing. It can also be just a criminal operation.
The drug running, hit squad, wet works, drug running, yeah. And these groups exist because you can keep them at arm's length, and if something goes wrong, there's plausible deniability, like it's a crazy cult.
Absolutely. And of course, some of them actually do have like a mind control connection, and I would think things like Scientology or the Raelian type groups would have that kind of MO, and we could look at even the so-called investigative groups like NICAP and MUFON, which I think are also CIA run.
This is kind of where we get to the broader definition of mind control.
Mm-hmm.
How kind of MK Ultra mind control, this stuff is outside sort of this operative black ops stuff. It gets into this mass mind control manipulation of the news, of reality itself, and that's where you get into your forte, which is Hollywood.
Well, and I should mention too that a lot of you brought it up in a recent talk, maybe the interview that was done with you, and it's something I've talked about some, and that's the co-opting of the so-called conservative movement. Back in the '80s with Falwell, Moral Majority, and
don't the Collins brothers get into that?
Yeah. And you can find a lot of the sort of the so-called right-wing CIA running a lot of that, back in the 80s, and bringing the Reaganites into this, like I said, the moral majority. And so you'll find the CIA, at Bob Jones University and places like that too.
Oh, that's like with I was reading Trento's book.
Yes, I have that book.
And Prelude to Terror.
Yeah.
and you realize a lot of these big conservative fundraisers have these intelligence ties, and that's how they, you realize how did they get so rich?
Exactly.
And that's he has a title called 7700 Leesburg Pike, which is an office building near where I live. And that's the office of Richard Viguerie. He's a big fundraiser for conservative causes in the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
And he's tied into South Korean intelligence.
Wow.
And you really get into some deep intrigue here. And basically, they at one level they act politically, but they're also probably funneling money. That's
exactly that's the angle that I was trying to get at. That's always involved in this kind of stuff.
They're laundering money. It's running money through the operation like that.
If you think about Katy Perry, her dad is a big charismatic minister, and he's best buds with that South Korean megachurch pastor who got caught laundering I don't know how many millions of dollars out of the church. And when the church came to him and asked him why, he said, well, I was trying to fund my wife's K-pop career. She was trying to be a K-pop star, and she needed millions of dollars to get
And that's also like the, of course, Unification Church, right? So there you go.
Now it's Goonies, and that's directly to the Bushes and Washington.
And that's when you get into sort of this private intelligence network with this Safari Club and
Safari Club talks about. And that's interesting because that's a lot of times people think about this idea of the right wing and the left wing. It's a controlled dialectic, but there's also kind of a right wing and left wing within these intelligence operatives, right? So people would think of Gloria Steinem being this left winger, right? Well, she's working with CIA, right? And then you've got these so-called right wingers, right? Bush Senior, right? Well, he was head of CIA. I'm just giving those as examples.
Gloria Steinem is an interesting figure because she was the recipient of the Chester Bowles scholarship.
Which was, I think you argued, was just kind of, what is that?
It was literally given to one person, her. Never, because she went to Smith College, which is a real expensive elite college, and she came over.
Well, this is the idea of a made man, right?
Yeah.
The made man, and it's the Rockefellers who were involved in setting up the CIA from the outset, right? So it's not just British intelligence, but it's this same apparatus.
Yeah, the same corporate banking interest that
Wall Street, right?
Yeah. Prior to that, it was kind of informal. And basically what happened was, in 1947, this incestuous relationship was formalized. At least here in the States.
I'm sure you've seen the Hitchcock film Notorious.
Is that Gregory Peck?
No, that's the one with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman.
Yeah, a long time ago.
I think it's 45 or 46. Well, it's interesting because that's part of the CIA, and he's this foreign operative, but he's not identified. So I'm wondering if he's supposed to be OSS, because it never says what he is, but he's doing CIA type work, and OSS was formed, I think, 42. So I don't know. I always thought that was interesting because I watched the film recently when I'm doing my Hitchcock analysis.
Well, yeah, that was formed, but largely under British supervision, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's the British Security Executive or something, or BSE or something. That was William Stevenson, the Intrepid or something. He was Canadian, right?
Yes, Canadian spymaster. And then, did you know that Hitchcock? Well, I guess